In today's episode of The Unmistakable Creative, we get into part 2 of Andy Dixon's amazing story about serving a life sentence, and we discuss all the lessons he's learned and the insights he's gained from both his time inside prison and his time outside. I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com. I want to go back to the very beginning of this story and really kind of dig into your childhood a bit. And sort of the very first question for me is sort of around, the loss of a mother and how that impacts your life. I think it's almost ironic that we're recording this on Mother's Day of all days. And sort of how that shaped and influenced you growing up and how you think that impacted you.
Well, it's hard to say. I know that, being young, I'd like to say it kind of helps, when you're young and it happens to you. But, I was still old enough to always remember things like her laughter, her scent. She always smelled like soap. Her hair and her hugs were. I could remember the smell of soap, and she used Dove, and so I've always liked the smell of Dove. Isn't that weird? And and like I said, her laughter. She was always laughing and very happy, and sometimes, that Italian blood in her would boil up and she could get pretty hot, but that was usually saved for my father when he did something crazy. But, when she was gone, it was like, I don't know, I felt different, because other people had mothers, and here I am with a grandmother, but it's just not the same, And I remember one of the reasons I didn't like going to church was because they always had these big Mother's Day events, and I would be like the only young guy around that had to wear like a white flower, which meant my mother was dead. You wore red for, if your mom was alive, you wore white when she was passed on. And I don't know if you're familiar with that custom, but it was really, really crazy, and I would remember at those times, the lack of having my mom around. But as far as influencing me to, one way or the other, I'm sure that had she lived, life probably would have been a little different, but I'm not so sure it would have been much different because, she would have basically done like all the women before her in our family and just, done what the men say. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the way it was. The men were the men and the women were the women,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that that actually makes a perfect sort of setup for my next question, which is sort of the cultural influences of the time that you grew up in. I mean, the 50s and 60s you referenced, in the earlier part of our conversation. And I'm very curious always about how somebody's cultural influences kind of shape, the way they see the world.
Well, my cultural influences were from my mother's side was Sicilian. My father met my mother when he was in the Air Force during the Korean War. And she came to America, and when everybody got here, I got born in 1951. So that's how I came into the world. At right outside of Anderson Air Force Base out there in South Carolina was where my father was stationed. and they came up to Chicago for some reason. I'm not quite sure. There was a reason for it, and I was brought into the world at Cook County Hospital. So it's where I entered in at.
Mm-hmm.
It's where I came down. And so from cultural wise, my mother already had a brother that was over here in America, and he was knee deep involved in crime. And so culturally, I had my uncle, my mother's brother, who was already over here. Then I had my father, who was already involved in stuff with his father, who was an Irishman and a hellraiser and a crook. You know, they were all crooks. And also part of our Irish family was also mixed in there were some hillbillies. So we had this Southern Irish Italian mix. Yeah, it's just crazy bloodlines, I guess you could say.
Wow. You know, I guess one of the other things that you said earlier that really stood out to me was that you said that your grandmother was the first person to ever give you sort of a vision of possibility of a life that wasn't this.
Right.
And this is a question I think that anybody listening probably has had this sense of a vision of possibility at a very, very early age. And it's almost kind of like, I had Joe Loya here, who I'd mentioned to you earlier, who had been a bank robber, and he had talked about loss of faith, and I really regretted not asking him about that. But I get this sense that there's the vision of possibility, and yet somehow it doesn't materialize till way later. And
Right.
I'm curious about why. Like,
Why it takes so long?
Why did you lose the vision of possibility? And for somebody who feels that they want to gain it back, how do they do it?
Okay. My grandmother gave me those visions when I would visit her in Tennessee. And she would take me to the side and she would tell me, she would say, I know that from your father and your uncles, there is a strong draw to follow them and do what they do. And I know that what they do seems very exciting, but there is a very hard price that you have to pay for that life. And I just want you to always try to remember that deep down inside, you're a good boy. And that no matter how far down you go, you can always get back up. And she held my face between her hands, one hand on each cheek of my face, and looked at me dead in my eyes. And she says, you are a good boy. You have a beautiful soul. Don't let them destroy that. And so when I made my change in prison, one of the things I realized was, I have to tell my family, that I'm done with that too. And I called I told my father, I told my uncle who was still alive at the time, I said, I've made a change and when I do get out, I'm not coming back to that life. I'm just not going to do it. And I don't need any money or anything because see, money that you get from my family always had strings to it. Even if they said there were no strings, there was always strings. There was always this sense of you owe me, and I had to get rid of all that. I had to get rid of this feeling of warped sense of love. If I got to hurt somebody for you to love me, then that's not love. I had to remember that. But as far as somebody finding that vision that's given to them, you just have to come to a point in your life where you challenge yourself. If you never challenge yourself, then you're always going to be who you are. But I don't know anybody that likes to be doing wrong things or bad things or things that hurt their soul. I don't know anybody that likes that. I never enjoyed doing things that harm people. I didn't enjoy it. It was business. But just calling it business don't make it right either. That's just like a guy on death row who kills somebody. Calling it his job don't make it right, you know.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing in being a crook, you know. Calling it your job don't make it right. And so, you know, I would say to anybody who's caught in a vice of violence and anger that you don't have to live that way. You can choose to live another way, but you first have to change who you are.
Mm-hmm.
You really do. You have to change who you are, and you have to realize that you need to change who you are. You know, some people are so far down the rabbit hole, I don't know if they can ever get back, to be honest. The good news is there's not a lot of people like that, but there are some people that are so wounded and fragmented that I don't think you can put them back together. You know, it starts when they're young. You know, they get beat up and sexually abused and treated like an animal, and they're just, you know, they can't ever trust anybody. They're just, you know, they're totally mad.
Mm-hmm.
They're broken, defeated.
Yeah. You know, one of the other things that, excuse me, one of the other things that I am really curious about is the relationship with your father. You know, what that was like growing up. I mean, you mentioned that he was in prison when you were at a very young age. You know, we've talked a bit about your mother, but I'm curious, you know, what that relationship was like and how that influenced you.
All right, so my father, like I said, he was my hero. He was he was a tough guy, and all my uncles, all my family, you know, a bunch of tough guys. And one of my earliest memories of my father is, you know, him fighting guys and kicking them out of the clubs and, you know, running them off and, you know, stuff like that. So that's just the kind of guy he was. But these people, they all, you know, we all live by a code. You know, your friends are your friends, and you do pretty much whatever you can for them, and you kind of stick together. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and you know that's how the economy was. You know, your economy worked because you all worked together. You know, for a common cause, which was to put money in your pocket. But I also realized that a lot of times that money went to people that didn't do nothing. You know, they were just like, you know, they were the top of the food chain, so you had to pay them a little bit just to operate in the neighborhood. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of like that.
So you're really, I mean, you're like a real life version of Goodfellas almost.
Um, I don't know about all that. I mean, you know, I've seen these shows, you know, and I actually knew Hill. You know,
Uh-huh.
he passed away, but yeah, I knew some of these guys. You know.
Wow. So, you know, the thing that you know, other thing you said that really stood out uh, to me was that at a very early age you were imprinted with this connection between violence and love, and that
Right.
sort of has played itself out throughout your entire life. And you know, I think about imprints and how they impact us. I'm really curious about how we overcome our imprints. And, you know, my business partner, Greg, likes to say, you know, your temporary circumstances don't have to become your permanent identity. And I look at a life like yours and I wonder, you know, I'm thinking to myself, wow, I don't know how I would handle the situation. But the fact that you could be imprinted with something like that and still overcome such an imprint, I'm really curious about how we overcome, you know, our imprints that limit our lives
Well,
based on your experience.
on my experience, you overcome it because we're human. I mean, there's certain things about being human that are common to us all, and that is that within all of us is uh, a desire to love and be loved. That's just something that's in us. We want to be connected. We want to contribute, and sometimes that gets screwed up. And with me, it got screwed up when uh, the idea of what love was got screwed up. So love got screwed up with me when it was about an action that had to be committed to receive the reaction that you gave the name of love to. So, like, if I smacked somebody down and all my friends and family congratulated me and hugged me, that felt good. Just like if a kid hit a baseball and got a home run and come in and step down on home plate, his father would come out and hug him for, making such a great play. It's the same dynamic. I mean, uh, a kid that does good in school and brings home straight A's, he gets the love of the family. If I went out and broke in a store somewhere and stole $500 or $600 and brought it home and put it on the table, that was like straight A's.
Wow.
So now, having come from that, how do you get to where I'm at today? Is that you grow up, you see how other people in the world live. I mean, that's like you take a person that's never left, I don't know, Greenville, Tennessee, a little small town in Tennessee, born there, never left. And then all of a sudden, when they're 50 years old, they get to leave Greenville and go to New York City and see all this, multicultural setting. They get to see what all these people are actually like instead of what they heard. So now all of a sudden they got to change their view, right? Because they if you've never met let's say you've never met a black person, and then all of a sudden you meet a black person and you find out, well, they're not so bad. Or if you never met a Mexican and you meet a Mexican, you go, oh, well, they're not so bad. Well, in my life it was like, okay, you meet these squares, they're not so bad. You meet you know, you just meet people and you find out that they're not so bad. They got their good points about them too, you know. And I think that comes full circle, because when people would meet me back then, their thought would be, well, he's not so bad, you know, and then to them I wasn't, The only people I'd be bad to were the ones that I was, going to steal from or something, then that would be bad. But I never stole anything from anybody I knew.
Mm-hmm.
We always stole from people we didn't know. It's not, you would never take anything from your friends or people in the neighborhood. You just didn't do it. So, and in our sense, it was kind of like, it's kind of like we were like a little country.
Mm-hmm.
We'd invade another country. That was okay. We'd invade them, take what they had, and that's spoils of war. And one of the things I mentioned earlier, we kind of thought of ourselves as the country, and the United States of America was another country, and the United States of America, they're the baddest kid on the block, so you kind of want to stay away from them. If there's a bully in the neighborhood, you don't want to mess with him. So in our way of thinking, the government was the bully. You stayed away from them, because if you didn't, they'd squash you like a bug, because they had more guns and they were meaner than you were.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's kind of the way we thought about it.
So let me ask you this. One of the things that you also mentioned was that you had done a bit of time in the military. And you mentioned that, and then you mentioned also when you would see these sort of square guys, you would think, you don't know how lucky you have it. So two questions come from me for that. One is it seems like there was a handful of opportunities to course correct here, to almost go the other way and not end up where you did. And I'm very curious, what is sort of going through your mind in those moments when you could have course corrected? And also, when you see those square guys, these guys don't know how lucky they are. I mean, other than that, what else is going on there? I mean, what's the story you're telling yourself in those moments?
Well, I guess I have to go back to the moment. I remember we had been trying to think how to tell the story here. We had had a job that we'd done, and this guy had the goods, and he didn't show up, and I was waiting outside of his place, and I was going to take care of him for what he had done, and I wasn't particularly comfortable doing it, but I knew it had to be done, and I stayed out there probably 8, 9 hours waiting on him, and a lot of people walked by during that time, and I was like in a gangway near the building, and that's when I saw this young guy and his girlfriend walking by and holding hands, and I just had this passing thought how great it would be like that, But if you can see where I was at the moment, that wasn't going to happen. I didn't have nobody like that in my life. I didn't even, and to be honest, I didn't even hardly date because I didn't want to bring a woman into my life. I didn't want to I'd already seen guys get married and the way they would cheat on their wives. And I just didn't want to be like that. I didn't want to have a family raised in that kind of environment, which goes to the point that I didn't like what I was doing. But at the same time, I didn't see a way out.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, now looking back, you can go, oh, you could have done this, you could have done that. Well, maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Mm-hmm. So, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the time inside prison. I mean, I've had two friends here who have spent time in prison, but I mean, your sentence was far beyond anything either of them. So, I mean, Joloya maybe, but my friend Meg's was 2 years, but 27 years. I mean, when you went in, did you know how long the sentence was going to be?
Well, when I went in, I was given life. And so, I knew life is life, but at the same time, prison always, when you go to prison, you got good time that you get, and then they cut time different ways, like for instance, when I went in, the average life sentence, a guy was getting out on parole after 13 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I figured, I'll do 13, and I'll get out. Well, this tough on crime thing hit about that time. So by the time my 13 come rolling around, 13 had done changed to 20. And then, 20 changed again to life without. I mean, they just went on this runaway, lock them up, throw away the key thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, it just kept getting worse.
So, I mean, let me ask you this. When you're sitting there knowing that, hey, you know what, the next 13 years of my life are going to be spent in this situation. I remember telling a friend once, I said, if I knew I was going to go to prison, I would just kill myself, because I think I'm not, I would be so terrified about the experience and what was going to come from it. And yet, what has happened, the people who I've spoken to, people like you, people like Joloya, people like my friend Meg Warden, have dramatically altered my entire perception of our prison system. And to learn that there are these amazingly nice people in prison. Hell, I mean, Meg Warden is one of my great friends, somebody who I never thought would be one of the greatest influences in my life. And I guess, for me, the question is, when you look at that and say, I've been given 13 years, what goes through your mind in a moment like that? Is it a moment of giving up? I mean, what's going on in that moment?
Well, most guys that commit crime, they're risk takers anyway. You know, I
Uh-huh.
mean, let's face it. There's an old saying, uh, too lazy to work and too scared to steal. And so a lot of people out there in the world today, they're like that. They're too lazy to work and too scared to steal. So they spend their lifetime bouncing around from, some kind of program to a program, looking for a handout or a couch to sleep on, or, they're just bumming their way through life. Well, guys that are too lazy to work, but not scared to steal, they're risk takers. And so when they go to prison, they've been playing games all their life. Prison's just another game. Now, of course, it can get violent up in there. You can go up in there and you can get killed, you can get raped, you can get beat up. But usually that happens to people, unfortunately, that aren't equipped for prison. And those are actually your innocent people.
Mm-hmm.
The people I feel sorry for are the ones that go to prison for stuff that they should never go to prison for, like druggies.
Mm-hmm.
Drug addicts and people that do drugs are not criminals, but they throw them in there with people that are, you know. And to me, that was so sad, because now you got a guy that comes in, he's got a drug problem, and then by the time he gets out, he's still got a drug problem, because prison don't stop you from having a drug problem. You can get drugs in prison. So now when he gets out, he's got skills to where he can be even a bigger drug dealer.
Mm-hmm.
So it's insane. And as far as prison, and I don't know if I can make it in there, you know there's no saying, you don't know what you can do until you got to do it. You don't know what you can do until you got to do it. And I have seen some of the guys that come in prison, you look at them, you think they'd never make it, and they take to prison like a duck to water. And I've seen other guys that come in and you'd think, oh, that guy, he ain't going to have no problem. And that's the guy that wraps a rope around his neck and jumps off the tier.
Wow.
You never know how that's going to play out. But prison has changed a lot. When I went to prison, it was 80% physical and 20% mental. And what I mean by that is when you go in, 80% of your troubles are going to be physical, which means that when you go in, if you lay down the groundwork, you're never going to have a problem. And what I mean by laying down the groundwork is you go in, you don't start no crap with nobody. You don't go in there like I'm Superman or something. You just go in there and you stand. You ain't got to stand tall, but you do got to stand. And if you do that, you're going to be all right. It don't matter if you get your ass kicked. You just got to, throw a punch. You can't just, take it. You got to stand up. And so you never have a problem after that. But if you go in and you're not able to physically, muster up just 10% of courage to stand up, you're going to get abused and passed around like like a little girl. So sadly, that happens to some people. But most people back in those days, they got it. They would stand up, they'd fight a little bit, and next thing you know, they'd be in there telling jokes in the chow hall and, managing really well through prison life. And then it changed. And it became to where now prison shifted from being 80% physical to 20% mental. It became 80% mental and 20% physical. Because when you go into a prison today, they have it so locked up tight that there's not going to be a lot of fighting. And they still have killings in prison, but they don't have nearly as many killings as they used to have. I mean, you could kill an inmate and they'd give you 10, 15 years, and they'd run it in with what you were already doing. So basically, you get to kill for free. You could kill another guy and it wouldn't cost you nothing
Mm-hmm.
because they just run it in with what you were doing. Nowadays, if you kill another prisoner, you can wind up on death row, or they'll just, give you a sentence that you're never getting out. They'll give you life without parole. So guys are, you know, trying to get through prison life without killing somebody. But on the other end, prison administrations these days, they they like to toy with people's lives and their minds. They get off on disrupting their days and messing with their head and telling them, "Oh, you'll get out." I know you got 180 years, but we got a program coming out here in a little while that's gonna you're gonna fit into it, and we're gonna let you out then. And then 5 years go by. Well, we got another program. Another 5 years goes by, and we got another program. And before you know it, you got guys that's been in there 15, 20, 30 years, and now they're old and they're sick, and now they're laughing at them and telling them, well, looks like you're going to die here.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, they got their games that they play, and it's ugly.
Yeah.
And they get by with so many different things. Uh, when you tell about an individual case, it just doesn't seem to. I don't know how you get people to understand how important it is, the small things that a person in prison could have. Like they'll say, okay, you can have paint supplies and you can have a TV and you can have all these things, but no one gives those to you. You have to make that money yourself and buy these things yourself. And it takes a long time to do this. The equivalent would be for you to buy a house and a car and start a family. And then all of a sudden I'll come in and say, you know what? I'm taking your house and your car. You're no longer allowed those things. And by the way, I'm going to break you and your family up. I'm going to send them here and send you there. And that's how prisons is these days. I mean, they'll come in and all these things that you have saved years to buy, because it takes a long time to save enough money on prison wages to buy a TV and art supplies and other things that you might want. And then they'll come in and they'll say, well, we've changed the rules and you can't have these things anymore. And then they'll take them away from you. And then a year or two later, they'll say, oh, you can have these things back. But they can't give you what they took because they done destroyed that. So now you got to save money again and go out and buy it. And then they turn around a year later and take it back again. Because, these things can drive you nuts. So that's why I'm saying prison has turned into a really mental battlefield. It's really, really hard on people. And one of the things that I saw happening during my time there was how they were criminalizing homelessness and mental illness. You got a lot of people that are homeless and mentally ill, and they just, the courts get tired of dealing with them, and they just send them to prison. And then they wind up on these psychological programs and wind up on psych wards and they don't get help. They lay around in there eating their own feces and everything else.
Wow.
So I don't know about you, but vacuuming is not one of those things that I ever look forward to doing. But as you know, your environment has a huge impact on your creativity. So I still like it to be clean wherever I'm living and working. But now it doesn't have to be something that you deal with. If you're like me and you grew up in the 80s, you probably fantasized about the day when cleaning your house would be like it was for the Jetsons, meaning you don't have to lift a finger. Well, the good news is that we're already kind of living in that future. And the easiest way to make sure your floors are clean every day is with the iRobot Roomba Robot Vacuum. It cleans up after itself. The Clean Base automatic dirt disposal takes convenience to a new level, automatically empties its own bin into an allergen lock bag that holds 60 days of debris and traps 99% of pollen, mold, and dust mites, so you can forget about vacuuming for months at a time. Let the Roomba clean for you instead. It learns your home, finds dirt, and empties itself on its own. It's got powerful cleaning performance made effortless. Remember, if it's not from iRobot, it's not a Roomba. To learn more, go to irobot.com/unmistakable.
So, you know, I want to ask you about one other moment during your time there, which I guess to me this seems really like the arc of this story, or the sort of the peak of the story that we've been telling here, is when you finally make the decision that that's it, I'm done. After so much time and a life in which you've committed to one of crime and violence, you make a decision that that's it. And I mean, that's a drastic change in a moment like that. And I'd love for you to sort of expand on making those kinds of changes in our own lives. And what is that like? I mean, to go from one extreme to another, it's like you go from a violent, somebody who's violent, to becoming just a complete pacifist.
Well, it doesn't happen overnight. I'll put it that way. It doesn't happen overnight, and it's just something that you decide that you're going to do, and then basically you spend the next 5, 10, 15 years fighting your nature. Because it's like your nature for such a long time was to be violent, and now all of a sudden you've made this decision that you're not going to be violent anymore. You're going to be a pacifist, and so it's really hard and difficult. And I guess one of the stories that I can relate is that I had gotten to the point to where my pride was involved. I thought I'd gotten to a point where I was like, you know what? I'm such a wonderful pacifist. I won't even kill a cockroach. I'll take a trapped rat and release it in the yard. I won't even kill an animal, and I'm proud of this. And then one day in prison, there's this guy who has a mental health issue. He's a paranoid schizophrenic, and I don't know why, but God either tells him to do something or the CIA does. I don't know why, but if people have a mental illness, that seems to be something that's always there. It's either the CIA or God makes them do crazy things. And so this particular fellow had this thing in his mind where he thought the CIA was out to kill him. And I don't know how it played out in his mind, but one of the things I always used to say is that it doesn't matter what we think, because the craziest person in the world, whatever they do, makes perfect sense to them. Because if it didn't, they wouldn't do it. So I don't know why the guy decided to jump me, but it made perfect sense to him. And I was watching a TV program, and I got up to go use the bathroom. We had a common bathroom. And I go in the bathroom, and I'm urinating in a stall, and I see this bright white light. And all of a sudden, I'm like dizzy, and I turn around, and here's this guy. He's like 6 foot, I don't know, 6'5", 6'6". He's a big fellow, and he's got a knife in one hand. It's actually a shank, but it's more like an ice pick type. And he's got a sock full of batteries in the other hand. And he had just hit me in the back of the head while I was taking a piss with this sock full of batteries. And I'm standing there and I'm looking at him. And in my mind, I'm wondering, what the fuck? And all of a sudden, he swings out again and hits me in the forehead. And it liked to knock me down. I was like, I felt my knees buckle. And then he started moving toward me with the knife, and I went on automatic. And the next thing I know, I've busted this guy's head. I've busted his nose, his mouth. I've got him on the ground, and I've got the knife away from him, and I'm getting ready to plunge this knife right straight through his heart. And I stop myself, and I break the knife off, and I drop it down the drain, and I look at him, and I say, brother, what is your fucking problem? And he looks up at me and he says, "What's going on? What's happening? What's going on?" And I get up off of him and I help him get up. And I'm cleaning the blood off of his head and his nose and his mouth, and I'm helping him get cleaned up. And all of a sudden, he's okay. His psychotic break is over. And I have this huge concussion. I wind up going to the hospital, and they bring me back from the hospital because I have a really bad concussion. And I'm laying up there in the infirmary, and I'm thinking about this guy, and I'm thinking about how I hurt him, and it's hurting me. I'm like really hurting. And Dr. Whites comes up to visit me in the infirmary to see if I'm okay, and I tell him I'm okay. I mean, how's this other guy? The guy's name was Larry. I said, "How's Larry?" He said, "Well, he's all right. He's got a few stitches in his head, but he's going to be okay." And it really hurt me that I hurt him. And it took weeks, talking to Dr. Whites and a couple other guys, and they were saying, it's okay to defend yourself. It's okay to defend yourself. And I said, "You don't get it. I broke my deal. I hurt that guy." And then Dr. Whites kept asking me to play it out and tell what happened. And I told him. He says, "Stop right there." And I said, "Where?" And he had me stop at the part where I was holding the knife and I was going to plunge it into his heart. He said, "You didn't do that. You threw the knife away. You stopped when you had hurt him enough and you didn't go on." And I was like, "That's right." He said, "Would the old you have done that?" And he was right. I mean, even though I had done a violent act, it was like in self-defense, and I sort of rationalized that around a little bit, and I guess I kind of got to the point where I realized that, yes, I'm a pacifist up to a point. I will protect myself. And of course, if somebody tried to hurt my wife or something like that, I'm not just going to stand there and let that happen. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So, but it was a very sobering moment to realize that I wasn't a pure pacifist, that what I really was just a guy that wasn't going to hurt anybody, but at the same time, I wasn't going to let anybody hurt me or my family.
Mm-hmm. Really just mind-blowing stuff. I mean, I love that you brought up that it doesn't happen overnight. I think that's one of those things.
Not at all.
I think that when we want to change, we expect that. I think we're incredibly impatient by our very nature. And my guess is when you have as much time as you did, patience was something that you had to cultivate. You didn't have a choice.
We would like to, have things to happen in an instance. I mean, we live in that kind of society. I mean, we don't even like a headache. We got to have a pill for that. Mm-hmm. So, we'd like, especially in America, we like our pills. We like instant relief from everything. Unfortunately, in the real world, there's no automatic. What is automatic is the decision to do something different. Now, we can make that decision. We can make a decision that says, you know what, I'm going to move away from this direction and head this direction. Don't mean you're going to get there overnight. It depends on how far the trip is. My trip was a long trip. I'd spent probably over 30 years being what I was. So I wasn't going to get to where I'm at today in 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
But from a year of making my decision, I was already seeing the results. It's like a fat guy on a weight loss program. You might not lose 100 pounds in a year, but you see 2 pounds a week fall off. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So you could like see things that you're doing differently, and you feel different. That's probably the main thing. Even though you might still have a reaction like somebody being talking loud, and your reaction early on might be to feel like getting up and smacking him down. Well, and as you begin to change, somebody talking loud, you're like, uh, you're looking at it in a different way. You're like, instead of wanting to smack him down, it's more like, how did he get there? And having compassion for why did this person get, what made this person get to where they're at? Because, and compassion is a good word, because you have to have that same compassion for yourself. And it took me a while to get there. I knew I wanted to be a different person. I didn't want to commit violence anymore, but also I had to get to a place where I had compassion for me. I had to get in touch with, I guess, what you'd call my little kid, and hug him when he needed to be hugged, because I missed out on a lot of kid hugs. I didn't get to have a childhood. I grew up quick. I mean, at 12 years old, I was a man. I did a man's deed, and I had to act like a man. So, most kids today, their parents try to keep them kids even when they're in their 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And, when I was 14 and 13 and 15, I was hitchhiking all over the United States when I would escape from reform school. I mean, I'm out on the dark streets, at that age, hustling and keeping alive and stealing and making moves, So that's a long road to go down. And so when you make that change, it's a long road to go down. And again, it doesn't happen overnight like maybe we would want it to. But I would encourage anybody that wants to change the direction they're in, like if it's drugs, if it's relationships, whatever it is in their life that is a challenge, I would encourage people, stay focused on the goal that you want, and don't be upset with yourself if you don't get there right away. I mean, if you're a drug addict and you've been in rehab 5 times, fuck it, dude. Go 7, go 8, go until you get it done. Because if you quit, then you're done. That's kind of like what the Reverend told me, Father Kerwin. I mean, when he told me, if you can't, you can't, he's right. If you get it in your mind you can't do something, guess what? You can't do it. So I would say to people, if you're stuck somewhere in your life and you don't feel like that's where you want to be somewhere else, then you got to start making that move in that direction. And if something happens that stops you for a moment, don't let that something be a roadblock. Just let that something be an obstacle, and then you work your way around that obstacle.
Mm-hmm. So, there's so much here in your story. I mean, we could easily, like you said, you're like, it would take 100 episodes to cover everything. So, let's shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about 2 things. One is coming out of prison and sort of this adjustment period. And then I would love for you to talk about youth turns and the fact that, when you told me that the way they count, future prison beds is based on the children of existing prisoners, that's incredibly disturbing to think that that's how we're planning. So we're planning for the worst, which is horrible. So I want to really help you voice this message out to our audience. But I also want to talk about the transition of coming out and kind of what that was like. And then I'm just going to give you the floor to talk to us about this issue and why it's so important, and tell us what we can do to help.
Well, for me, and everybody's experience is a little bit different. Some people, when they come out, they've got family to go to. Excuse me. Some people don't. And so the experience is different. But from my experience, I think one of the things that helped me was that I was on work release. And being on work release, that allowed me to kind of ease my way back in before I was actually released. I would leave the prison at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I wouldn't have to report back till 7 in the evening. Excuse me. And so the job I had, I was a plumber. And so doing that, it kind of helped me get over some hurdles. Like I remember one time going to a gas station and sitting there waiting on an attendant to come out. I didn't realize that, it was now all, self-service. Everybody had to pump their own fuel. I was waiting for a guy to come out, do my windows and pump gas and, give him some money. But I realized real quick that, those days were gone. And another weird thing that happened to me was I would stand in front of the doors, and wait on somebody to come and open them for me, because I hadn't had the experience in a long time of opening my own door. So I got over that quickly, though. I mean, that's, I never waited for an attendant more than that one time. I got it. Once I saw what it was, I understood it. And same thing with the door. After standing there, and it was embarrassing, I guess, well, I don't guess, I know it was. It was embarrassing to kind of be behind the 8 ball on all that stuff,
Mm-hmm.
But these are the small things. I prepared myself pretty good for the bigger things. I'd put back a little bit of money, made all the right moves that I could make. And also had family. My father was still out. I had my wife. So we had a home to go to. So I didn't, like a lot of guys, I didn't get just dumped on the street.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you horror stories about people that get out of prison and they got nobody and nowhere to go. And they essentially get dumped on the street. I got a guy now that he's my house sitter. While Linda and I travel, he takes care of our property in our house. And when he got out on a halfway house program, and they let him out on a Friday, and it was a holiday weekend. The halfway house people didn't even come and pick him up. He was stuck there at a bus station. I had to make arrangements at 2 o'clock in the morning to get somebody to go down there and pick him up. And it took 4 or 5 days to get him straightened up, and was able to talk to some people at the parole headquarters down there in Tennessee, and they were helpful. I'd like to say that, some of these government systems try to be helpful if you know who to talk to. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so for some people, it's difficult. And we really, really need reentry programs. I mean, that is just going to have to happen at some point. I mean, good ones. Not these fly-by-the-night con jobs that are out there, but they need some real good reentry programs. And so my transition was pretty smooth. The day that I got out of prison, it was January, and there was this surreal moment when I walked out the gate, and I asked myself, do I want to look back? And I thought, sure I do. Why not? That was home for me for 27 years, Yeah, I just, turned around. I did look back, and I just said bye, and picked my wife up and swung her around and around, and we just, hugged real tight and cried a little bit and got in the car and away we drove. And she wanted to take me to an Indian restaurant. It was one of her favorites. And so we went there, and I'd never eaten Indian food before. And I guess for some people, curry is an acquired taste. And so, but I did enjoy the salads. Those are good. And after that, we went over across the street from there. There was a Catholic church. I wanted to go in and light a candle. And I did. I lit a candle and gave thanks for my freedom. We went home. We had a great meal at home later that night. And we got busy with it.
Mm-hmm.
It had been a while. So, we just had a great time. And And then the next day, and I started going back to my job. I was still working where I was working when I'd gotten out. And after being there for a while, I got to noticing, they're always going to treat me like an ex-convict around there. The company that I was at, they wanted me to work 14-hour shifts, but they weren't willing to pay me what they were paying the other guys. So I started looking around for something better to do, and that's when I took a van that my father had given me, and I started hauling auto parts around town. I knew some people that got me involved in that, and made pretty good money at it. And then met a guy that wanted me to haul parts for Chevy and full on back and forth from the Tennessee area down to Mississippi. So I did that for a while. And then I realized, I need to get a truck, and I could probably do better. So I got a truck, and then later on I got a couple more trucks, and just started my own business. And I realized, pretty quickly that working for somebody else with that label of ex-con, they're not going to treat you all that well. At least that was my experience. You're going to have to, they're going to pay you less than anybody else. They're not going to give you a fair wage, and but they're going to expect you to work like a dog. And I'm like, well, I can work like a dog for myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I encourage everybody that's getting out of prison, to try to find something that they enjoy doing, and go out and make that their job. And Linda and I, we try to help people when we can. Without naming names, we've helped quite a few people, and some of them have gone on to be successful. Some of them, not so good. We've had people that, took advantage and stole from us. But, I got an old saying well, it's not an old saying. It's kind of a new saying that I started when I got into my own self-healing. And that was that, I got to be willing to take a risk on people because people took a risk on me. And, if you aren't willing to put your hand out there to get it smacked, then you're living a life that's way too safe. And if you're living a life that's way too safe, then you ain't living.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's the truth of that.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this, this part about coming out takes me back to a scene from the movie Shawshank Redemption. I don't know if you've seen it.
Shawshank. Oh, yeah. I seen that. Morgan Freeman on the beach. He meets his buddy or something.
Yeah, exactly. So, the thing that really struck me as you're talking about, the time that you've spent and coming out, was there was this scene where he says, I don't know if I could make it on the outside. I've become institutionalized. And, you clearly sort of overcame that. And, I'm really, you said that, you were prepared for the mental battle more than the average person when coming out. And I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on that whole idea. I mean, do people become institutionalized, and does that just cause them to go back?
What happens, I don't, the word institutionalized is a word. It's just a word, because when you get right down to it, what people call institutionalized is letting themselves off the hook for not having good reentry programs. That's the real truth. I mean, if these guys coming out had something, if there were real rehabilitation and if there were real reentry programs, then most of these guys that are being called institutionalized would be just fine working jobs and staying out of prison. What happens is a guy gets out of prison full of hopes and dreams and ambitions, and he realizes that once he gets out, there's not much he can do. Because when he gets out of prison, he's got $25 in his pocket, And that is gone within probably 10 or 15 minutes of hitting the streets. And now he's got nothing. He's got a mission home that he's staying at, or he's sleeping off in an alley somewhere. He got nothing. And there's nobody in a lot of these guys' cases that'll help them, because in their formal life as a druggie or a thief, they burned a lot of bridges. So no one's willing to give them a hand. So all those dreams and aspirations that they had hit the cold wall of reality, and they realize they're on their own. They got no help. No one's knocking down their door to give them a job. They're paralyzed. They don't know what to do or how to act in society. And most of these guys coming out are their emotional IQ is somewhere down around mental retardation. I mean, they just don't know how to socially. They don't know how to do it. Now, prison is full of people, and you can check this out. Anybody can. It's full of people that have these tremendously high IQs, but their emotional IQ is like, retarded. They're off the chart retarded, because they just don't know how to handle their emotions and societal interactions. They just don't know how to do it. Mm-hmm. They've never been taught. They've never had anyone to work them through it. And so when these guys get out, again, they're just paralyzed. They don't know what to do. So what do? They do what they know, which is what? Go back to drugs, go back to stealing, and then the next thing, they're not the smartest guys in the world. That's how come they get caught and they go to prison. Mm-hmm. So it's just a cycle. It's a vicious cycle that will continue until somebody says, hey, you know what? We got to do a better job. We got to have real reentry programs. We can't have this, conmanship going on. We got to really work with these guys and try to help them stay out. And like I said, I've worked with guys, my wife and I have, and the ones that we've worked with, they're doing good. They're doing pretty good. We've had one or two that went back, mm-hmm. and I'll tell you why they went back is because they were in a big hurry to regain everything that they thought they had lost, and that set them up for failure. Because you can't gain 20 years in a year. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
And so you try to tell these guys you can't do that. So institutionalized, I don't believe in it. But what I do believe is that guys get so broke down that the only alternative for them is to go back to prison. Mm-hmm. That's all they got. They don't have nothing else. And so people have come up with the word institutionalized, concrete mama, all this stuff. Like somebody really wants to be in prison. Nobody wants to be in prison. I've never known anybody that if the gates fell down would just sit there.
So let me ask you this. I mean, you've brought up breaking the cycle, which I think is actually a perfect transition to sort of wrap things up and really get to the end of our conversation. But one more question around the process of coming out. What I see in you as you describe the process of, recognizing that somebody was going to work you like a dog is that you saw opportunity. And you saw opportunity to rebuild yourself. And you are clearly somebody who broke the cycle. And, I'm curious what you think it is that distinguishes the person who breaks the cycle. I mean, what is it about their mindset that enables them to break the cycle from the ones who don't?
When preparation meets opportunity, I mean, when you prepare your mind to do things and then the opportunity arises and you're already prepared, you just step right into it. And so I was already thinking and looking and trying to figure out things that I would do when I got out. I had several different plans, from simple to complicated. My most simple plan was before I got married and met my wife, I had a plan of getting out. I was going to wash dishes and ride a bicycle, basically sleep in a sleeping bag and find a warm climate and save all my money for like 5 or 6 years and have enough money to start my own business. Because I figured it up. I did the math on it, and I figured it up. And I said, in 5 years, I could have about $100,000 if I save every nickel. Don't spend no money on rent or gasoline. Ride a bicycle, sleep in the park, take baths, wherever I can grab them. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
I had a plan. And so people, if they put a plan together and they stick with the plan, they can work their way out of almost anything.
Wow.
And that ain't just guys coming out of prison. That's anybody.
Yeah. That's why I asked that question, because I knew there was something really powerful there. And I mean, I think that it's really interesting how resourceful we become when our backs are against the wall. I think most people think that they wouldn't have the capacity to generate ideas the way you did, but I think often it's only being put in those situations that causes us to start, getting creative about solving our problems.
Absolutely. What's that old saying? Necessity, the mother of invention.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's true. That's true. When you get in a situation, you're going to figure it out. I mean, that's part of being human. We figure these things out,
Mm-hmm.
And I always tell everybody, don't cut yourself short. You don't know what you can do until you got to do it.
Yeah. So, I want to wrap things up here by having you talk a little briefly about youth turns. I mean, you talked about breaking the cycle, and I was just telling a friend about the first half of our conversation about what you said in terms of how prisons plan for the future. The fact that they use the children of inmates to do their statistical modeling, that was probably one of the most disturbing parts of our entire conversation to me. And I felt that, wow, the fact that we're not doing anything about this other than planning for the worst, that's horrible. So I'd love for you, consider this a moment to plug, what it is you do and what you're hoping to accomplish in terms of trying to change this problem, because that really is a horrible thing to hear.
Well, a lot of different states use different methods to try to figure out, the need for prison beds, and they have these different models that they use. But I've heard it said time and time again from different professionals, and I know they're being straight about it. The biggest indicator that they have is they know that anywhere between 50 and 70%, depending on the region of the country and the area, basically, they know that these young kids that have parents in prison are going to grow up and go to prison themselves. I mean, it's a given. They know it. And so that's one of the things that they use when they start figuring out, how many beds we're going to use in the future. I mean, you go to any prisoner that's been locked up for a while and you ask him one simple question. Have you participated lately in a survey that was done in prison asking prisoners how many children they had? And when they said how many children, they're talking about not just, children that you have a wife or a grandmother or somebody out there taking care of. They also want to know how many children you got that you don't even claim, but are yours. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because they know these kids are in trouble too. And it's terrible. And it breaks your heart, because when I was in prison, I would see these kids, like I said, 7, 8 years old on the picnic area, running around playing. And next thing you know, 10 years later, they're 18, 19 years old, and they're in there with a number on their back for robbing a drugstore or stealing a car or whatever. They were there.
Mm-hmm.
And it just would break your heart. And they would go the regular route. They would go to reform school, and then after reform school, they'd graduate and go to penitentiary. I mean, it's almost like middle school and college.
Wow.
And high school and college. High school's reform school. College is your local state pen. Not Penn State, but state pen.
Wow.
So, that's the route. And this is no secret. There are a lot of people that have programs that they're running, and they're trying to address this issue, and one way or the other. But But see, you can't just do this by helping the kids. You have to help the family unit. That whole family unit has to be helped. And it can be done, and it's worth doing. And the money that would be saved is phenomenal. I mean, taxpayer money, we're spending enough money on the average guy that goes to prison. We could send this guy to Harvard for the money that we spend on the average guy in prison. Now, we could spend just half of that to keep him out of there. Look at all the money that taxpayers would save. To me, it's a fiscal issue because there's tons of money that could be saved if we would just do the right thing and the smart thing and give up this hop along Cassidy yippee-ki-yay cowboy shit,
Mm-hmm.
Lock them up, throw away the key, rope them and hang them and all that crap. We have to start looking, in my opinion, at criminal activity as a mental health issue. And we have to start looking at mental health issues and stop trying to criminalize everything. At one time in this country, there were only 3 federal offenses, and now they got enough books to fill a frickin' library of federal offenses. I mean, this is lock up crazy nation that we're living in. And the good news is there's a lot of politicians on both sides of the aisle. There's a lot of citizens out there now that are aware of this, because we've reached what I call the saturation point, where now everybody seems to know somebody that's been to prison. There was a time when nobody knew anybody, or they might have heard of somebody that knew somebody, but now almost everybody knows somebody that's been in prison. And it's just getting harder and harder not to, come in the crosshairs of the law. This drug policy that we have in our country, it's insane. It's just plain insane. And they know it, and it needs to change. We don't even need to have a drug policy. We don't need to have it. We just need to let people do what they do. And then the money that we would save from this war on our citizens, we could use for rehab centers and things that would actually help them instead of throwing them in prison. I never saw anybody get help for a drug problem getting thrown in prison. That's not help. Mm-hmm. That's perpetuating the problem. So anyway, don't get me started.
Well, Andy, I really appreciate you coming to join us and share, your insights with our listeners, because it's interesting to hear you say that now everybody, you come across probably knows somebody that has gone to prison. And I can tell you, in my lifetime, I never thought that I would ever chat with somebody who's gone to prison. But I felt that when Brett told me everything about your story, I felt we had a very moral obligation to give you a microphone to talk about this. And so I'm going to close things up with one final question. And this is actually, sort of a departure from everything that we've been talking about, but it's more a question about creativity and how we stand out in the world today. Our show is called The Unmistakable Creative. And I'm really curious, based on sort of the experiences of your life and the things that you've seen and seeing the internet after 27 years in prison, what is it that makes something or somebody in your mind unmistakable?
Makes them unmistakably creative, maybe?
I guess that's
Is that what you're asking?
That's a good way of putting it. I mean, basically, what is it that makes them so distinctive that it's them?
That they listen, that they have listened. To be creative, you have to listen, because creativity comes from the universe out and in. And if you're not listening, then you're not getting it. You're not feeling it. You're not projecting it through your poetry or through your painting or through these wonderful music or whatever creative function that you have within you. And I think creativity, whatever the format, is an expression of God or of the universe, because we're all born to be creative. I mean, that's what we do from the time that we're little babies. We just giggle and laugh when we're able to predict something, and predicting something is like the forerunner of a creative process. And so we're born to create. And it's funny you should mention that, because a friend of mine, I don't know how familiar you are with country music, Mark Colley, he came into Brushy Mountain and did this wonderful documentary about how music brings out a creative spirit in people, and it actually helps them to express deep down emotional issues, which is therapeutic to them and helps them to rehabilitate themselves through their music. And the documentary was called The Mountain, and I think it's coming out soon. But anyway, it was a great thing. And so that was all about what you're talking about, creativity. And I believe we all have it. We just have to listen and open up to it.
Awesome. Well, Andy, like I said, it has been my absolute pleasure to have you here as a guest on the Unmistakable Creative. I mean, this has been one of the most riveting and mind-blowing conversations I've had the good fortune to have in the time that I've done this. And I really, really appreciate you coming and sharing your story and your insights and your mission with our listeners here at the Unmistakable Creative.
All right. Well, you can tell everybody that they can tweet me or Facebook me or whatever. I'd be glad to hear from your audience.
Awesome. And I'm sure you will be. All right. And for those of you guys listening, we'll wrap the show with that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming? Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.